Hi folks, today I want to talk to you about controlling user input with Picklists. So Picklists aren't a foreign concept for anybody. We've all filled out web forms and things like that where we're asked to choose from a list of values rather than just doing sort of free text input, which is great for a lot of the things that we might do in a planning and analysis application, things like driver-based forecasting, which we're actually not going to cover this time. We're just going to focus on creating those pick lists. But we're going to look at 5 different approaches to creating them. I'm going to do that in a CapEx data entry form because that's something that a lot of folks have and they look fairly similar regardless of my industry, so it's a good example to start from. And they very often use pick lists for data entry. So we're going to start there. We're going to take a look at static pick lists where I just enter a couple of values and talk about when we should and more often when we shouldn't use those because they're not a big favorite of mine. We'll talk about dimension-based pick lists, which I see a lot more frequently but are still not the bulk of the pick list that you want to create, because very often your dimensions will have things like totals that you'll want to filter out, which leads us to the next approach, which is a subset-based pick list. And this is probably the most common that we'll see or use anywhere because they allow me to filter on things like levels, use only the leaves or whichever level I happen to need. I can also put a little twist on subset-based pick lists though, because instead of just using static ones where I've said give me the leaves of this element and make that a fixed list, I can actually use dynamic ones and do some really interesting queries at the time the user selects from that pick list. So lots of fun we can have with those, and we'll look at some examples. And then the last approach that we're going to talk about is the one that's going to give you the most control over what the user sees, but is going to require the most effort as well. And that's using a pick list control cube, which I can either populate via rules, which is probably the most typical case, or if I've got a really small cube, I might actually physically load the values to that with a TI process or something like that. So we'll take a look at all of those approaches. It'll take us a little while, so let's get started.
So you'll see here I have a very simple capital expenditure planning cube, which has my CapEx list, which is just a list item that I can use to allow people to enter multiple lines of data. By hotel, so of course my organization type dimensions, which is my hotels, we're forecasting these capital purchases for an individual hotel each time we do this. And then our capital input dimension, which is where we're going to be doing the bulk of our work. So let's jump right in and start fixing this up. And let's stack this a little bit so we can see our progress. And we have to make a lot of progress because, as you can see, I've left this very deliberately unformatted, and even something like description, where I don't want a pick list, isn't quite yet set to be text. So let's apply that, save it, and we'll see that our description is now free text that I can just type in. The next field in our form, described by the element capital request in progress, is intended to be for information only, so that the contributor can indicate to a potential reviewer that they have or have not yet submitted a request through a typical asset management system. So we also want this element to be text-based, just like the last. But what's different about this, of course, is because we just want an answer of yes or no, we can use a pick list to enforce some consistency in this. And because it's for information only, and I will never, ever use this in my model logic, I will, in this special case, allow that to be a static list where I just specify yes or no as my responses. And the reason that I emphasize that is that when you create a static list, Performance Modeler has no means of enumerating from that what the list of values would be to pair with the dimension if I were trying to either look up or accumulate from this value. We'd have no way of really knowing its contents. We'd just have a list of strings. If I thought for even a moment that someone might ask me to someday summarize these in another cube, I would want to specify a dimension containing the values yes or no as my pick list. But for this one time, we'll just leave that as a static list. We'll say OK, We'll save all of those and see the result, which now prompts me for a yes or no. Do I already have a request or not? Our next field, described by the element capital request form number, is again for information only for reviewers. They could look up that capital request if they decide they're going to be generous and approve it when they see this in the forecast, or kick it back. If I had data from that system, I might prompt with the available capital requests for this location, but I don't. So I'm just going to allow free text input here because my IDs could be alphanumeric. So I'm going to allow free text input, and I'm going to do something else just to be kind to my contributors. And it isn't really the focus of this video, but I still want to show you. Let's just do a save here. And I'm just going to create a simple cube calculation here, and I'll call it edit request form number. I'm going to look at my cube calculation and the string expression. Again, we're working with a string element here, so we need that. And I'm going to do a simple test to see if the user has said no to having a capital request in progress, then NA for my request form number. Else, STET, which is of course do not calculate. And you might wonder, why go off topic for something like that just to show that we can block this? Well, as a contributor who doesn't necessarily understand the model logic or what they're looking at, they may feel that although they've just said they don't have a capital request in progress, they're still being demanded a form number. In which case, do I have to go create one? What do I have to do? Right? It's just to remove a little bit of that heartburn to show them that they don't need to enter that form number. And if it takes me 2 minutes to add something that will save my 1,000 contributors hours, then why not? So getting back on topic, we've now got another item here where a pick list would make sense, our request status. So once again, just information only, just to give our reviewers an idea of where this request is in our external capital purchasing system. Once again, this is going to be text. So we'll specify that this is a text format. Apply that, and we'll add a pick list for this one as well. So this time, because I may someday use this to prorate based on the status of a request, I might actually use a dimension. So very simple, I happen to have a dimension for request statuses that I can use here. Now this one doesn't have any total, so I don't have to worry about someone selecting the total inadvertently when they should be specifying the status. So this one should work just fine as a dimension. And if we take a look at that, we've got a number of statuses here: draft, submitted, approved, verified. Now, what I might do here is use the same technique we just used for our capital request form number to block that status where it obviously isn't needed, but we've gone off topic already. So let's move on to asset types. And you might think, well, hey, isn't that just a repeat of what we just did? Aren't my asset types, surely we have a dimension for that as well? And of course we do. Have a dimension for asset types. We want to be able to aggregate on asset type and that sort of thing in our model. But for our pick list, we don't want to show our total of asset types. So if we look at our dimension here, we've got total assets, which is all of our land, buildings, leasehold improvements, and so on. We don't want to use that total. So what I'm going to do instead is to create a subset. So I'll just do a new subset. I'll call this asset types leaf, and all we'll do here is just create a very simple filter that will say hide by level and hide above this level. I'll save and close that, and now we'll specify that as our pick list for our asset type dimension, and of course my asset types leaf subset is what I want to use there. We'll save again and see our choices now. Moving along now to our cost, it doesn't require a pick list, but I simply can't leave that there with decimal places. I'm never going to ask someone to forecast to the cent. We'll leave it blank if it's 0. Digit grouping if it's in the thousands. Apply that and save. Similar to our cost, our acquisition date doesn't need a pick list, but I still want to make it easier for users to enter data, and one of the easy ways to make it easier for them is to, at least when we ask them for a date, to give them a calendar control, which they'll see if we specify that format is a date type. And if I use the long type, that's pretty easy and clear what's days, months, and so on. So I'll apply that fellow. We'll save and see that now when I specify an acquisition date, I get a calendar to specify that date. And now we're on to our service month. So service month is kind of an interesting one. So first of all, of course, we want it to be text as well. But what do we want for the pick list here? Now, instinctively, you might think, well, it's fine. I could just use a subset like I did for my asset types. I don't want the total of my months or my quarters or anything like that. But I do just want a subset. And that could work. But again, creates a potential hole for our contributors where I specify an acquisition date of November 3rd of 2016. And when I click on my service month, I have to scroll through January of 2016 through October of 2016 to get a service month when it actually might go into service. So instinctively, I want my service month to be a forecast month. I want that to be a forward month. Now, I could try to do some calendar logic off of that acquisition date, but it isn't really necessary. As long as I shortlist to my forecast months, it should make it a lot easier for my contributors. And as long as I don't use a static list, then I don't have to remember every time my forecast rolls from month to month that I need to go update that subset, because we don't really want to have to depend on that. So once again, I'm going to create a new subset. This time I'm going to do that for my time dimension. So we'll do a new subset, and I'll call this forecast. Now let's give that a little bit more real estate here. I'll just stack our capital input up there. Take a look at our forecast dimension and note that I have an attribute here which describes whether or not the month in question is actual or forecast. And it's only populated at the leaf level, so I don't have to worry about filtering on level 0 items first. I just have to filter out my members. Now to do that, I'm going to use MDX, which many of you may not be familiar with yet. We're going to cover it very soon, just not in this video. In any case, I will give you an idea of how this expression works. I'm simply going to specify that this is dynamic, which is every time we're referencing this subset, so when a user clicks on the pick list, this is going to create a new set of members dynamically based on a query. And that query is going to filter from all elements of my time MY dimension, looking at the actual forecast attribute that I have here, and selecting only those items which match forecast. So if I apply that, what we see happens to the subset is that we lose our top level, our total year, because that didn't have anything specified, and we also lose all of our actual months. So my users aren't scrolling through a bunch of months that are really invalid. So let's save that and then specify it as what we want for our capital input again. So this time, our service month pick list is going to use a subset. Of course, this is going to be a dynamic subset that we're using from our time MY dimension for forecast elements. Again, that's going to get executed every time, once I save this, every time a user clicks on that drop down, we're going to get a new list of forecast months. So it may only change, of course, when my month rolls over, but I don't have to remember to update anything. I'm just going to be relying on that MDX to specify my forecast months. Our last pick list approach is easily the most powerful, but it does require some qualification, because any pick list that you define using a pick list control cube, even if they're dimensional in nature, are not going to be available when you're using the link UI, either as a natural link or a link inside of a cube calc, for matching to do a lookup or especially an accumulation link. In each case, you're going to have to manually write the appropriate rule and likely the appropriate feeder as well. And to explain why, let's take a look at our content pane where we're going to create the Picklist control cube. And we'll review its structure. So think about it this way. A Picklist control cube is basically a mirror of the cube itself, with the addition of a single dimension which only contains this value member and allows me to specify text at any point in the cube. So I'm not limited to a particular dimension axis. I could have a different pick list for this item and this item if I wanted to. And let's actually try that just to prove it out. So we'll go back to my leaf level where I'm having people enter things, and I'm just going to put the text in here that I would normally define as my pick lists. So let's do the first one as YN, the second one as yes, no, and then see the result when we save that and look at our CapEx planning cube. So now we have a choice of YN in the first cell, yes, no in the second cell. And the next thing you might wonder is, why on earth would I want to do that? Well, obviously you wouldn't in the case of a simple yes, no. But there are cases where you will want to take advantage of that context to drive the actual subset that appears. You might recall when we started this and I introduced it, I told you that you can do that with MDX as well, and that is true. You can derive context using MDX. So for example, if I wanted specific choices to appear based on which hotel I was using here in my context, I can do that with MDX without even creating a Picklist control cube. But it is dependent on me referencing elements of that dimension, the current member of that dimension, when it is in context, physically in the cube view. So if a user were to nest these because they're planning for 2 hotels, and my hotel dimension is on rows or columns, then I can't actually use MDX to derive the current member and pop up a different selection of items. And I would have to use a Picklist control cube to make certain that that context is correctly derived. When you get those cases, you may be very tempted to do as I just did and populate the intersections of the cube with the real values. And I just want to caution you that that can be a really expensive endeavor, even if I'm using Turbo Integrator to generate the strings, because there are so many potentially. I'm actually adding a lot of weight to my model, so I'm creating a pretty big dense cube if I were to try to populate all of them. And in this simple 3-dimensional cube where none of the dimensions are particularly big, it shouldn't be a problem. But if I were in a large sparse cube, I could potentially be creating a whole lot of strings that I'm then going to have to store and retrieve from. So the more common approach is to create a string expression. As with a string expression, even though I may be using that expression everywhere, it's not actually going to be populated in memory until I use that string expression. So for this string expression, I'm going to create a manual rule. So I have my Picklist control cube here. Here's my rules. And now we're going to write a string rule that's going to determine exactly what that pick list is going to look like. Give myself some room. And this will apply to my capital request form number. That's the scope of the expression, again on the left side. Further defining that this is a string rule. And the string I'm going to create here is going to look an awful lot like a standard Picklist string. So I'm going to say I want to use a subset. The subset I want to use is from my car number dimension, which we're about to take a look at. And the subset I'm trying to get to are a number of pre-created subsets I have that filter my car number based on its region. So these are regional, and I want to be able to pick those based on the region that the hotel is in. So to do that, I need only concatenate a function that's going to give me the region attribute of my hotel. So let's pick hotel as our dimension in this case for any hotel, so whichever hotel I'm in. And then I want to pick the region that that hotel is in. And if I save that expression, you'll see what happens to my Picklist cube, which is now populated, of course, just for our twin aurora as all the northeast subset. But if I take a look at it this way, we can see that for all of my leaf elements, I have the actual attribute, and that's the subset that we're trying to get to. So there's our Picklist control cube. We'll save that, and now take a look at our capital expenditure planning cube. And you'll see here that all of these car numbers are preceded by northeast, which is my subset of car numbers that are allowed for the northeast region or apply to the northeast region. If I were looking at a different hotel here, I should see the regions that apply to that. I just need to find one that's not in the northeast, and there we have one in the south. So a slightly contrived example, but hopefully you can see how you can filter based on context using a Picklist control cube, as well as create some more interesting business logic about how to drive what that Picklist is. So just to summarize, we've looked at how we can create Picklists based on a static list of items. So here are yes, no. How we can create them with a dimension, like we did for request status, where all the elements of that dimension are in the pick list. We looked at how we can do that based on a subset, so that we're only choosing from leaves or a particular level or any sort of subset that we want. We've looked at how we can create a dynamic subset with MDX that will update itself at query time to choose our service month. And then finally, we saw how we could create a Picklist control cube that allows us to write specific rules or populate individual cells in that cube with the subset that we want to appear. So I hope you found that useful. As always, thanks very much for your time and happy modeling.